Good morning and welcome to Spokane Community College and welcome to the virtual Hagan Center. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce and host Emily Neuberger. She's a Master of Fine Arts graduate and a grant recipient at Brooklyn College's fiction program, and she previously worked as an editorial assistant at Viking Books. She has a music degree from New York University where she studied musical theater and writing. Performer for 15 years, she performed at Carnegie Hall in Stephen Schwartz's birthday celebration and sang for Stephen Sondheim at the Music Institute of Chicago. She currently lives in Brooklyn, New York, and her novel, A Tender Thing, is her debut novel. So this morning's format is where Emily's going to give sort of a presentation and kind of a workshop, if I understand it, or actually whatever she would like to do, because we're thrilled to have her here. And for those of you who are joining us on Facebook, if you have questions and when you have questions for Emily, if you would just type them into the chat, they will get sent to me and I will ask those questions of her. So without any further ado, welcome Emily and thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. My novel actually came out in April of this year, which means that I have had very few chances to talk about the book. I've done a few events like this, but the whole tour and everything was canceled for obvious reasons. And so most of the conversations I've had about the book have been from my living room. But it's really exciting to, get to actually dive back into it and talk about it a few months later. So thank you for having me. So this is my debut novel. I have a copy right here. And it is set in the 1950s in the Broadway musical theater golden age, which is when musical theater writers like Rodgers and Hammerstein were writing things like The Sound of Music and South Pacific. Lerner and Loewe were writing My Fair Lady and Camelot. And it was this explosion of creativity on Broadway. But it was also a time of social change because a lot of those musicals are not quite as maybe whitewashed or PG as we might think they are now. They were very daring at the time and they were taking a lot of risks about social commentary and doing things that I think they were maybe not happening on film in the same way or were very risky for theatrical audiences. So it follows a young woman named Eleanor who is from Wisconsin, and it is her dream to audition for a Broadway musical. And she comes to New York with her best friend, and she ends up cast in a musical called A Tender Thing, who's written by her favorite composer and her idol, Don Mannheim. And A Tender Thing is the first in my fictional universe interracial love story between a white woman and a Black man on Broadway. And it becomes a political firestorm, and Eleanor finds herself being a political actor in a sense, where she's suddenly in the spotlight, and she learns that she has a tremendous lot to learn about what it is to be a friend, an ally, that her lack of active prejudice is not really enough in order to play the role of someone who is actually trying to devote her life to love across difference. So the book is about many things, but I would say mainly it's about female agency in business, sexuality, the roles of friends and white people in terms of allyship, and love across differences. Now, I want to just read a little small part before I get going from almost the very beginning, which is about Eleanor on her farm and what it's like in her mornings on the farm. It was early, and dew still shone on the soybeans in the neighboring fields to the east. The land was flat and pale green, the sun sending rays straight into her eyes. Pink, fatty bodies rammed her legs, snouts nudged her hands and pockets in search of food. She greeted the pigs each by name and dumped feed into the trough, rubber boots sinking into the mud. Eleanor was the one in the family who'd named the pigs. The names were born from a desire to bait rather than sentiment. It enraged her father. She hated the sows most, gelatinous, sedentary bodies reserved for reproduction and consumption, bellies already resembling Christmas hams. When Eleanor saw them, her tongue rose with sharp nausea. She slid out of the gate, using her thigh to keep the animals inside, and returned to the barn. A cat uncurled from its place on the supply shelf and darted away. The hay all around her was dry from the heat, which was good. Sometimes on humid days, it was stuffy inside the barn. She closed the door so only a stream of light glowed through, inhaled, and began to sing. Even surrounded by the muffling hay, Eleanor's voice filled the space. She always warmed up with ascending scales. Her voice was a strong soprano with a persistent rasp, as if she had just woken up. She'd learned to sing in church, but despite her talent, she was passed over for solos. Her mother said everyone was jealous. Her best friend Rosie said her voice was too sexy for Jesus. As soon as Eleanor had gotten old enough to manage the morning chores alone, she'd started rushing through them to make sure she had time to sing before breakfast. Some days, her barn mornings were all the practice time that she got. So even when she did not want to wake up, she did, because the only thing worse than rising at dawn to feed the pigs was a day without singing. And that's where I'll stop. We can go to the next slide. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today was in writing historical fiction. I think we often think of historical fiction as just a window into the past, but I exist in 2021, and as a creative person, every idea in my head is prompted by the things around me in the world today. So even though this book takes place in 1958, it's heavily inspired by the things that were going through in my life when I wrote it. So this picture is me, obviously, on the stage of the Winter Garden Theater in 2019, I believe. Yes, 2019, in the fall at a performance of Beetlejuice the Musical. But that theater is the theater where A Tender Thing opens in the book in 1958. And that theater has been around for a very, very long time, and actually was hosting the musical West Side Story in the 50s at the time when A Tender Thing would have been opening. But just thinking about the same structures that are around today and how I would go to Broadway and see the musicals, and all of that was in my head when I was writing this book. And we can go to the next slide just to talk about that. So this is also a picture of Times Square in the 50s, which is what Eleanor would be looking at when she went to the city for the first time. So one of the things I think about as a novelist or a writer in general is that, or any kind of artist really, you're taking in these problems from the world that you see, and we can't necessarily solve them for ourselves. We have big questions about the world, like global warming, or what the virus is going to mean for our social lives as we go forward, or all these huge questions that you can't answer in one day. And they're the kind of things that keep you up at night, or even deeper existential questions that are not based on these specific things in our lives, but things about God or things about our families. And they take many, many years to work through. And you may not ever find an answer really, but you might find some peace with these questions. And they're the kinds of things that just, you have to think about and think about and think about and just reevaluate over and over again. And a novel takes many years to write. And I think my way of processing a lot of difficult things at that time is to think about the emotions and the problems in my life and sort of try to construct an entirely different person's life who's going through the same concerns or questions as me, and to see if that maybe brings some wisdom, or at least makes me feel like there's a commonality across experiences. So it's like almost creating a mirror image. So A Tender Thing was absolutely not autobiographical. I have, other than being a singer and being a young white woman, I have very little in common with her. But the questions she faces throughout the book were questions that were keeping me, were like very much motivating me and also puzzling me at that time. So we can go to the next slide. So I started writing the book in 2016. And these are some of the things that I was thinking about in 2016. So obviously 2016 was the election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, which was very formative for me as a young woman, to see a woman up on the political stage for the very first time, like with that much attention on her, and how America reacted to her, and the idea of a woman in power and what that did to the conversations around the debates and everything. So that was a huge concern. Donald Trump using, it's not that racist rhetoric is anything new in politics, but being so bold as to make campaign slogans and make declarations, just completely bald-faced racist statements. And the idea of that becoming just a part of the political discourse and seeing that. And then I went to the Women's March in Washington, and I found that sign on the ground. I didn't make it. But I think I was thinking a lot about the 50s at that time because of Make America Great Again, which was supposed to be hearkening back to post-World War II in the 50s. And this idea that the 50s were a better time for America, or for, in my opinion, certain Americans, and certainly not most Americans. And just all the different conversations around race relations in our country, what my role as a white woman is looking like. At the time, I was also very concerned with like what it was to be loving someone who is not white, who trying to be a good partner, good friends to people who are not white, who are not like me, who didn't grow up with the privileges that I grew up with. And at the same time, I had just graduated college and left behind the idea of performing or singing, because I decided that that wasn't what I wanted to do. So that was the personal struggle. But most of these ideas were about social change in our country and this idea of the 50s. And because of my musical theater background, I thought of the 50s maybe a little bit differently than Donald Trump did, because I knew that musical theater, at least in the 50s, was not quite as, I don't know, we have this like innocent view of that time, or like this very stiff or quiet sort of 2 parents, 2 children, white suburban family. And I knew that at least on Broadway, they were taking enormous risks and showing things that had never been shown before. So I thought about taking all of these questions and setting something in the 50s and finding a young woman who would be going through the same things I was going through, and how differently they would look back then. And so anyway, this is all going into the idea of what was just like stewing in my head when I started the draft. But then I can't say that I did any of this on purpose either, but I just know looking back that these were the things that were on my mind. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is my favorite musical, West Side Story. And by far, I think that I don't have other favorite musicals. This is the only one that's like the number one, and then all the other ones are just ones I like. And this musical opened in 1957 on Broadway. Fun fact, it opened on the same day as the Little Rock integration of schools. And it is a musical about a young Puerto Rican woman and an Italian boy in New York City. And they fall in love, and both are the boys in her family are members of a gang. And Tony, I mean, I don't know how much I need to say. I think this is a pretty famous musical. And Tony is a member of an opposing gang, and it's based on Romeo and Juliet. This musical was the inspiration for A Tender Thing, the musical. But the difference is that I wanted to make the female character in the musical that I was writing about white, to sort of, I think that we have so much history of how white women's innocence has been talked about or protected in a really dangerous way in relation to conversations about Black men. And I thought that by switching that gender role, it would become even more dramatic. So this is, yes, based on West Side Story. But another thing that was interesting to me about West Side Story was the idea that 4 white men could write this musical, which is certainly not perfect. And it is certainly not a like post-racist racial musical or anything like that. But I do think that compared to some of the things you see on TV, even today, it gets a lot more humanity across of the characters of color, and different than the movie, which has a very, I'm sorry, someone's knocking on my door, but I'm just gonna ignore them. The musical has, I have always been interested in the idea that people who are not coming from this experience whatsoever could write a very empathetic version of something. And I wanted to ask that question, which is the other sort of main question in the book, which is about the other main character, Don Mannheim, who is a white man, and he is writing this love story that he has no real experience with. And as a writer, that was the other major question, is who gets to tell which story and why, and who can empathize and how we can empathize as writers. And West Side Story, I think, is not a perfect example, but considering how long ago it was and how that conversation was not maybe talked about as clearly as we talk about it now, I think it's pretty amazing that they did it. And I think it came from a place of empathy as opposed to a place of trying to maybe get something exactly right about someone else's cultural experience. So that was, yes, I think that that's something that we're still sort of figuring out, and you can see it on Twitter all the time. You can see it in the New York Times book review. It's just like, well, this is good, but are we allowed to talk about this? And I think sometimes it's not good, and sometimes it's very, very harmful. Like all the conversations surrounding American Dirt this year, that book that came out, and just it's something that we didn't really have the privilege of talking about before, because the only people telling the stories looked a certain way. And so setting this in the 50s again was like a way to sort of talk about that in a different way than we would be talking about it now. We can go to the next slide. So the last main theme in this book is female agency and gender roles, and also just love across like different, like I said, love across difference. So in the book, Eleanor is a young actress who has no business experience. She doesn't have a bank account, because women back then were not allowed to have bank accounts they weren't allowed to have them at all. They had to be married, and it was their husband's account. So she's making this money. She has to put it under her mattress or in her sock drawer or something. And she's all of a sudden entering into contracts, and she has no experience. But this is a time on Broadway when these women were the box office draws for these shows. Like, here's a picture of Julie Andrews and My Fair Lady, or Ethel Merman and Anything Goes. And you can name, or at least I can name, a lot of women from that time who were serious stars. They were like, they had these huge contracts, but they didn't have any negotiation power or anything close to it. They weren't on the creative teams. They weren't directing musicals. They certainly weren't in the production conversations. And so they were almost these facades of power, which has always been really interesting to me, because Broadway as a genre is sort of defined by these women's voices and their singing voices, much more than the male voices. But the idea of Ethel Merman's belt has sort of become a foundation of musical theater writing. And yet, I'm sure she has some crazy stories about being disenfranchised, and even if they didn't have the chance to talk about it in the press or anything back then, you can look at who was making the decisions for them, and they were all men. And some of them were gay, but most of them were in the closet, and almost all of them, or I think all of them, were white. So it's just interesting about like who gets to look powerful versus who actually is powerful. So that's why I wanted to write about a young woman who is put in this position, like a leading lady on Broadway. She's not actually anybody. And there's a part in the book where she starts to feel secure because of this position. And Don, her composer friend, who has about 20 more years of experience, and he's a man and he's won Tony Awards and he has all this power, essentially tells her that unless she makes a huge splash in the New York Times, she will just go right back to the beginning and she'll be nobody as soon as the show is over. So it just goes to show that there's not really, like, these successes don't add up to anything if they don't have any power in terms of negotiation. They just, like, you can get one and then you can just fall back down again. And the musical is also, like I said, a love story. So the book is a little bit meta because it's about the rehearsal and writing of the musical, not the musical itself. But that means that Eleanor and Charles, who is a Black man and her co-star, become friends because they're working with each other every day. And through that friendship, she starts to see her own failings because she does continuously fail him, and he's not really interested in teaching her how to be better, but she just, like, can see it straight up because she's never spent this much time with someone like him before. And I was thinking a lot about the musical South Pacific, which was written around this time, and how it was at the time a very, very daring musical about race. However, all of the characters of color none of the characters of color speak except for one. And so the most outrageous and politically active song in it is called "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught." And it essentially says that racism is not real, it's a choice. It isn't like a structural thing, and it is something that we all participate in. It is not something that is based on real differences between people. But it's sung by a white man who has just had sex with a mute girl from the South Pacific, who literally, not only does she not speak, she cannot speak. And so that was daring enough for Broadway at the time. But I was thinking, what if this is about two equal participants and two people who are shown with agency on stage together, as opposed to the white man telling us why racism is wrong. In West Side Story, they are two equals. And in the musical A Tender Thing, I wanted it to be two equals as well. But the difference is I wanted to write about the even more fraught relationship between white femininity and Black masculinity in America, which is, I think, something that I don't know if it could have been produced on Broadway in the 50s. It might have been just, like, way, way, way too much. So yeah, when I was thinking about writing this, I was also thinking about who could write it, like the white man, and why he might want to, because I think some artists want to do the daring thing for the press and for the knowledge of being the forward-thinking artist. And so all these questions, I don't really come up with any answers, but the point of what I wanted to talk about today was just that, like, historical fiction is not stagnant and is not about, it's these questions that just come up in humanity, and they might look different, but there's something to learn because we're looking at the past through the lens of today, as opposed to trying to replicate the past, because you could just read a book from the 50s if that's what you wanted to do. So those are the main themes that I was interested in. And those are my prepared points for today. I don't know if anybody has any questions.
We do have some questions.
Yeah,
which is great. So the first question from our audience is about, and this is a little bit of a turn from what you've been talking about, and we can come back to that, but I want to make sure we get this audience question. What are your long-term writing goals?
Oh my God. Oh yeah, we can talk a bit more about writing too. I think my biggest goal as a writer is to be able to keep writing, which means to have something like this feeling that I have of always churning through these questions and having something to write about, to never let go of that, because I think that the more you do it, the more interesting the work gets. And the things I was writing about when I was younger are definitely not as interesting, at least to me, as what I'm writing about now. And so just to be able to continue to do it. And I would really just love to like keep writing novels. And I think it's really hard, especially now. Yes, I got the contract for this book when I was very young. I was 24, and it was so exciting, and I thought it would like change my life. And then it came out in the middle of the pandemic, and it absolutely did not change my life, you know? So just knowing that it's like, that's not the point, is the events or anything like that, but just like that communion with the way I see the world and how I can turn it into a story. And hopefully that becomes interesting to people to read, because yeah, I think everything else is kind of the cherry on top.
That must have been, I mean, the pandemic has been a letdown in every possible way. That's a silly way of describing it, but it's been a real challenge, obviously. And what a, you know, congratulations to you on the book. But what a, what was that like? I mean, what has that been like to have this amazing experience in the middle of all of this?
Well, I think so. It came out April 7th. So I think that there was about a month of lead up to, so by the time the book date came up, I wasn't disappointed, because I don't know if you remember, but those weeks were just so, everything was changing so fast. So by the time I got to April, I knew there was no way this was happening. But I do remember calling my agent like the first week of March and being like, do you think this is going to affect the book? And she was like, oh, well, we'll just have to see. And it's just like ridiculous at this point. But, or we were canceling the events for the book release. And I was thinking like, maybe I'll get to do them later, or maybe I'll have a little party in August too. And it's just, I don't know. I started just learning that you can't plan ahead about anything. And it was, I had a Zoom event with my family and my friends that day, but it just changed everything. And it, especially for a debut writer, because I didn't have people who were actively like clamoring to read the book or who knew me or anything. So it's just like, okay, this is out now and I can talk to my family and my friends about it. But yeah.
In fact, that was how I was introduced to you as a writer, was because I won your book at an auction.
Oh my gosh, that was you.
Got the opportunity to read the book and thought, you know, this would be great to have this person come in and talk with us, because your book is, and you could not have really planned for this, but it's so timely. And yeah, I
signed it, and I was trying to like send it to UPS, but I was nervous to go to the UPS store because that happened in like when everything was shut down, and I was like, I don't know.
Yeah, complicated process for you for sure, and trying to market a book and get some exposure. Really, that would have been incredibly difficult. What do you want to write about next, and where do you see your writing taking you?
Well, I don't know where it's taking me. I hope it takes me somewhere. I think I used to work in publishing, and that gave me a good sense of, I think, just the business a little bit, because it can be very opaque for young writers. And I think, and it's not necessarily, I think in some ways it's designed that way. In some ways it's just, it's really hard to be an artist breaking into any sort of industry. So in terms of where it's taking me, I feel like I do have a little bit of a realistic sense of maybe I will be able to, you know, write full time and write books. Maybe I won't, but I hope my writing takes me in a more general sense toward interesting questions and toward life questions that are really deeply, almost transgressive or interesting to me, so that I'm continuing to grow and doing research. So what I'm working on now is a manuscript about a surgical fellow, a cardiothoracic surgical fellow at Northwestern Hospital. And it's, among other things, about like class in suburbia, prescription drug addiction, and a young man who is in his 5th year of residency to be a heart surgeon. And that has been amazing, because I met all these amazing doctors and got to talk with them and interview them and go to the hospital. and see them work. And that's something I didn't, go to medical school or anything like that. And I just always thought it was interesting and cool. And because of writing and just seeing this character in this way, I've gotten to learn all kinds of things about a fascinating profession and meet all these amazing, brilliant people who have had very difficult years. And some of them I still keep up with, and just talking to them through this year and what's been going on has been great.
Another question about writing in general, and then we have a series of questions about your book, but we'll kind of just see where the questions come from, of course. Could you talk a little bit about your writing process, and specifically, do you have advice for a first-time novelist writing a first draft?
I do. My process, I think what I've learned through, I'm fortunate enough to have a lot of very supportive friends who are also writers. And one thing I've learned is that all of our processes are really different. So I think when I was starting out, I would get more upset if I thought I was doing the wrong thing. So one piece of advice is that whatever works for you is what works. But usually I like to write first thing in the morning. So I'll get up, I work at a school. So I'll get up quite early and write for at least an hour before work, because I find that my brain is most available to me. And if I try to wait until evening, I have less to say. So that is something that I found to be really helpful. I think that writing longhand can be really helpful, because sometimes I think that computer, you get ahead of yourself and your ideas come out faster than they've maybe germinated in your head. And just the physical connection of your arm and the page can slow it down and let you sort of think things through. And in terms of just frustration, crossing something out, I think still lets you think that you've accomplished something, as opposed to deleting it and going back to the beginning. This stuff sounds small, but writing is always just tricking yourself that what you're doing isn't stupid, because for so long it's just you, and it takes so many hours and so much work, and it's just you doing this thing, and you have to keep convincing yourself that it's worth doing, because you'd probably rather be out with your friends or watching TV or something. And except on those days, those like magical days when you're really inspired, you usually don't feel that way. And then mostly I think it's reading is so important. And I find that when I'm really reading, my writing is always so much better when I'm really like taking lots of things in. I think it's like you have an inner ear, and reading helps you calibrate that.
Follow up to that audience question, who are you reading these days?
Oh, I am reading, I just started reading Girl, Woman, Other, which is so good. It makes me a little sad, because a lot of the scenes in it are about going to bars and theater and things outside. I've been reading, I went through a lot of modern classics that I don't think I had the attention span for during other times in the pandemic. So I read Faulkner, I read a bunch of Jane Austen. I was reading a lot of James Baldwin fiction, who he's really famous for his nonfiction, but his novels are just amazing. And I just got this book. It's actually right next to me because it was propping up my iPad, which is these memoirs by this woman, Tove Ditlevsen, the Copenhagen trilogy. They're her memoirs, but she wrote them in the 70s, and they just got translated from Danish this year. And it's like this kind of contemplative, a woman writing about family and love and all these things. I think earlier than we like to think of it, like the Elena Ferrante books, which are some of my favorites, but 50 years earlier. So I'm excited about that.
So switching gears a little bit to go back to A Tender Thing specifically, could you talk a little bit about what your experience has been like? I've been thinking about what that would be like to be a debut novelist and taking on, as an ally, this issue of, in that time period, in the 1950s, an interracial relationship, and then having it all kind of out there at this particular moment in history. What has that experience been like for you? I mean, obviously the pandemic is a factor here in terms of your ability to interact with people, but.
Yeah,
about that a little bit.
definitely. I was really scared, and I still am. I'm afraid that I will have missed something and written something that hurt someone by accident. I'm also worried that people will not take the time to see and will jump to a conclusion. I was worried. I spent a lot of time reading the book, asking for advice, reading other work. I mean, the main character and the narrator is a white woman who has like a more conservative experience than I do. So I felt safe, at least in that I wasn't going to be trying to personify someone that I didn't have the life experience to personify. But at the same time, there's just so many terrible stereotypes that white writers will use, or that just like novels have fallen into again and again and again. And I was trying to be so careful of that, and I just kept going back to the idea of like, I can navigate these relationships in my life in a way that doesn't feel so scary, but trying to put it on the page felt like I was just so terrified that someone would read it, and that my point was to talk about really how to love someone. They're platonic friends, but that's love, that they deeply love each other. And she is failing at acting that love sometimes, but she's not. And he understands that she loves him. So it's like, and I was worried that in trying to do that, the opposite, I would achieve the opposite thing. And I would end up making, like, just flattening someone, or, the absolute opposite of my intention. And I still fear that, because I only have my experience. So I just did the best that I could of just reading it again and again, and using like every sort of ounce of empathy that I have. The other thing that I know will happen with this book is that my takes on it will age, and that I will hopefully also evolve. And so I will look back and be like, ooh, that's what I thought back then. But that's really unavoidable, because I think if you're trying to write about what you really, really feel, it will change. And you're probably not ever going to be able to just like put something down and then be sure of it later on.
That's not really the craft of writing, is to be sure.
No. Yeah. It's like, this is what I was sure about at this time in my life. And hopefully I will grow and change. And hopefully the world will grow and change. And so that this no longer feels like the most open-minded thing. It actually feels more closed-minded.
One of the other things I admired about the novel, it's kind of one of my favorite, tropes, whatever you want to call it, when I'm reading things, is that you really, well, you talked about this, and you've got the story of these two people. You have the story of that you mentioned, the nods that became more apparent to me today as you were talking to, the musicals, South Pacific, and you can see kind of the presence, as you were talking about, of West Side Story, which of course we know kind of generates out of Romeo and Juliet. So there's this whole genealogy of ideas and writing and relationship and all of that going on here. And you accomplish that in the novel by creating this story within the story of, the tender thing within the story of these two friends. That's a really ambitious task. And I wondered what that was like as you were writing it. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to think of it as an ambitious task, because this all sort of just fell into my head, that I was like, I want to write about making a musical. And then I thought about what the most kind of interesting musical to write about making would be, and that's one that would have effects outside of the theater, not just that it would affect their real lives, not just their performance lives. So the difficult thing at first was which is just a technicality, which is which names to use in the scenes. Do I use their characters' names, Molly and Luke, or do I use their names, Eleanor and Charles? And when I'm saying Luke is doing something, is that what Charles is doing, or is that what the script says he's doing? And that just took some just like almost mapping in my head of when to call him Charles, when to call him Luke, especially when they're on stage together, because there are things that happen on stage that are in the musical, and then there are things that are happening, like he's looking at her a certain way, and it's in reference to a conversation that they had backstage. So it's like, that's the meta thing did sort of get confusing at some points. But what I was also interested in is the idea that she's actually not able to play her role at the beginning very well. Like, she is cast because she's naive, because she's sort of well-meaning but inexperienced. And so Don believes her to be someone who would embody sort of this like pure-hearted person who, in the time that she's in, it's not just that she has to be able to love a Black man, she has to almost be like able to like not engage with the way the world wants her to be, which isn't really naivete, but she's not like making an informed choice. She's like just sort of going for it. And Eleanor at first is doing that as well when she gets put in this musical and she becomes this political person. But in order to really perform that love, she needs to be like more sophisticated and she needs to learn more. So I was interested in how playing a role could help you change over a long period of time, and like getting to know a fictional person would change you.
So kind of related to that, another question from our audience. What kinds of specific research did you have to do into the 1950s?
So a lot of the musical theater research I had done just over the course of my life, but I read all kinds of women's magazines from the time, which was really, really fun. I looked up, fashion patterns. I read New York Times articles at the time. I like to sort of have a general idea of everything that was going on at the time so that I could draw on politics if I needed to, music if I needed to. But yeah, the women's magazines were fun because I wanted to know what they were being told, not necessarily what they believed, but we are sort of all products of our environments and celebrity culture and beauty standards. And so I read a few ones and I found this article that was dating advice for women from the time. And it was like so ridiculous. Like, one was like, you should carry a giant hat box down the street so that a man will come help you carry your box. And like, the only type of man who would ever do this would be a kind man, because I don't know, why else would they be helping you? And, or like another was like, you should go to a party and cry in a corner because an empathetic man will come wipe your tears. And instead of like that, you would look like, a girl crying at a party. But yeah, it was like these lists of like these victimizing acts that you should do in order to catch someone. I was like, there's no way that these women like believe, like, but that's what they were being told, So that was a fun thing to do for research.
Did you mentioned this, a person from our audience had a question about what other musicals did you research around race? I mean, you've mentioned a few, were there others?
Well, Showboat is a really big one too. That's sort of also one of the first musicals. It's kind of, that's like a complicated question of like, what is the first musical? What is an operetta? Like, when did one become the other? But Showboat was really interesting because technically that is the first interracial musical. And it is a musical about an interracial love story, but there's all kinds of politics going on backstage of like where the dressing rooms were and how the scenes are constructed, that the interracial plot is not actually, it's like about a woman who passes as white, who is not. And she's married to a white man. But it's incredibly transgressive for the time, but it's not quite as out there as West Side Story, because in West Side Story, they have sex. And it's like before marriage and everything. So they're sort of like, they're not making you imagine through a sort of sugary love song. They're like, no, this is a real relationship between two people. So that, then the other huge one is Porgy and Bess, which is not about interracial relations, but it is written by two white men and it is a Black opera. And I mean, there's all kinds of really interesting ones that take place after, but Rodgers and Hammerstein, who really only use this theme in South Pacific, were really interesting to me because they were doing these sort of socially transgressive moves in a lot of musicals, like in The Sound of Music, in Carousel, in different ways. But there really like weren't so many. That was part of why I was interested, is that after West Side Story and South Pacific, Broadway became quite an experimental place. And before these writers, it wasn't as much that way. And so, yeah, like talking about like who decided that like, no, we're going to talk about these things here instead of just giving people a pleasant night out that they don't go home and question their beliefs when they return home.
Interesting. Kind of circling back a little bit, one of the things you talked about earlier was the kind of naivete of, and kind of imposed naivete on women during that period, especially as they're, you know, thinking about contracts, et cetera, the management of money, all of those issues that you identified. You yourself are, you know, a performing artist and now a novelist. Where do you think we're at? Where are women at in terms of their power, you know, in the middle or post Me Too, in the performing arts?
Oh my gosh, that's really complicated. I think it's, let me think of what way I want to go with the answer to this question.
Well, and I didn't mean to hand you a terribly loaded question.
Yeah, well, it's
about your
like
insight.
different sides to it. I think now it's obviously like women have the opportunities for things to be better, but like would I have answered this question differently last year before the pandemic and all these things coming out about women leaving the workforce? Like we already knew childcare went mostly to women, and now it's completely obvious that that is true in a way that couldn't be sort of swept away with, oh, but my husband's job is more complicated than mine or something. It's like, what did they say? There are now as many women in the workforce as there were in 1980 or something like that. I don't remember the statistic exactly, but it's like so many women have been leaving so it's like, I think we're not nearly as well off as maybe we think we are. We just are taught better, so it feels more within reach. But I think that's one of the problems with like gender equality, is that people know better, but in practice, it doesn't necessarily pan out that way. Like they talk about housework, childcare. Now that couples are doing the same amount of work at their jobs, it is still 80-20 or something like that. Or so it's like, people know that that's not how it should be, but it doesn't necessarily pan out. I think in the arts, there's more room, but then there's conversations about intersectionality and like, who are the women who are allowed to tell these stories? And are you telling a story that is kind of just a reflection of the male side of things, but from the female side of things? But at the same time, there's incredible work that I think is like one of my favorite shows is Fleabag. And I feel like that's the female experience that is not designed to be pleasing to men in any way. And it is really brave and not pretty and not like cute and sexy or anything like that. So I don't really know what the answer is. I think there's a huge amount of politics it's like impossible even, I was just thinking about this, that like in the relations between women and men, like people who like live as women or identify as women, people who identify as men, when you put them together, no matter what they believe, there's still going to be politics, and there's still going to be a lot of things that they need to navigate together, because the perspectives are just too different.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Do we have other questions from our audience? Give them a minute, and while Jonathan's asking the audience, are there any more questions? And Emily, is there anything else that you would like to add that we didn't already ask you about?
I think that I just want to say, like, this book is about the live arts. It's a book, but it's about performance, and it's really heavily about music. And I don't know, I just want to say take a little moment to say that I really miss those things. And I'm sure lots of people here do too. And that I hope that one day soon those things will come back, and that I don't believe that Broadway or like musical theater, that these things will just not exist, but that it's almost like a human spirit thing. Like they'll come back, but it's going to take a long time, and it's very sad. And that's the sort of B-side of this book that I never would have ever been able to envision when I wrote it, that when I wrote it, Broadway would be dark, and would be dark for a year or more after. And I just like can't wait till I get to go again.
That's a real, that's an interesting metaphor to try to kind of interrogate a little bit, is the darkness of Broadway and the darkness of the arts is both a reflection of what's happening, but it's also kind of the impetus for what feels so dark for all of us right now who love the art. I appreciate you saying that, and I'm hopeful too, for your sake and for everyone's sake, that the lights will come on again soon.
They will. Either way, the people, the outlets are dark, but the artists are not. So that cannot be vanquished. It's just like more difficult now.
Yes. I appreciate the way you've highlighted today, and there was something in particular you said about that moment. I think you were maybe talking about Rodgers and Hammerstein, that moment when the artist, whatever their genre is, or whatever their medium is, that moment when the artist realizes that, you have this big responsibility as an artist, maybe, that you want to take on, and, to address some societal issues or whatever it is. And we need that more than ever in the world right now. And I appreciate the way you highlighted that in your talk today. Really enjoyed that. Yeah. Jonathan, doesn't look like we have any more questions right now. I just want to thank Emily so much for being with us today. This has been a delightful morning for me. And this is her book, A Tender Thing. That's why I was fiddling around in the middle of her answer, because I wanted to grab it out of my bag. It's a wonderful book, wonderful reading. Please take the time to go grab it at your local library if that works better for you, or better yet, please buy her book. I know it's available in multiple ways. And even better, if you're in the Spokane area, please go to our local bookstore, Auntie's Bookstore, and buy your book from an independent bookseller. Thanks so much, Emily, for being with us at Spokane Community College this morning, all the way from Brooklyn. This is the beauty of Zoom, even if it's kind of weird and strange and isolating. It's good to get out of our own space sometimes. So thanks so much.